Welcome to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast, empowering and inspiring your journey to optimal health. Hosted by Dr. Supatra Tovar, clinical psychologist, registered dietitian, fitness expert, and author of Deprogrammed Diet Culture. Rethink your relationship with food, heal your mind, and live a diet-free life. And Chantal Donnelly, physical therapist and author of Settled, How to Find Calm in a Stress-Inducing World. We follow our guests' journey to optimal health, providing you with the keys to unlock your own wellness path. Tune in and evolve with us. Hello and welcome to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. I am Dr. Supatra Tovar, and I am thrilled to have the author of Brain Over Binge, acclaimed author Kathryn Hansen, with us today. Kathryn, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yay. I'm going to read a little bit about Kathryn, and then we're going to get right into our questions. Kathryn Hansen is the author of Brain Over Binge and the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide. After recovering from bulimia in 2005, Kathryn has dedicated her life to educating and empowering individuals struggling with binge eating. She challenges conventional therapy approaches by teaching brain-based concepts to help others stop binge eating for good. Through her books, podcast, and online course, Kathryn provides practical, science-backed tools for recovery, focusing on self-empowerment without delving into emotional or psychological complexities. Welcome, Kathryn. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I appreciate you having this conversation with me.
Yes, we got in touch with each other. Kathryn reached out to me on Instagram and followed me, and I was like, I'm so excited. I've read her book. I cannot wait. I really wanted to pick your brain, and it's very cool. We're doing a podcast swap. Kathryn's on mine, and I'm going to be on hers, and we get to pick each other's brains, which I absolutely love. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to get right into the questions I have for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So your journey with bulimia and your recovery is very inspiring. I actually heard of your book through a client of mine who was reading your book, and then I picked up your book. Can you share what initially motivated you to write Brain Over Binge?
Yeah, I wrote in Brain Over Binge that I really wrote it for my younger self when I was in college and struggling with binge eating and just really couldn't get myself to stop. I promised myself, if I can find a way out of this, I'm going to write a book to help others. And I always liked to write, so it really went with my personality and my interests. And I did find a way to recover. And it was very different from what I had learned in traditional therapy, because that's how I tried to recover through the years of having bulimia. And it just didn't work for me personally. That doesn't mean I don't think it's valuable in a lot of ways. But when I recovered and it was so different from that traditional approach, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to tell people about this. So it really renewed that commitment to write the book when I recovered. And I did that, and I published it in 2011. And yeah, that was really the story behind it.
Wow. And just give me a picture of, I know people really responded to this book. What do you think it was about the way that you wrote and the way that you recovered that resonated with so many people?
I think the main concept is just that you're not broken. Nothing is deeply wrong with you. That was a main thing I learned in therapy, that you have emotions you can't cope with, or you have some sort of problem from your childhood that is manifesting in binge eating, or you're struggling with all these problems like depression, anxiety, loneliness, all these different things, low self-esteem, and you have to fix all of that in order to stop this behavior of binging that's really ruining your life. So that was a path I was on for a long time, of trying to fix those other things and really thinking something was deeply, deeply wrong with me, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually. And when I kind of redefined things in terms of the brain, I was able to recover rather quickly. So I think people responded to the fact of like, this isn't such a deep, deep problem. This is something that you actually can recover from in an efficient way without needing to solve all of your life's problems. So it's really a message of empowerment that kind of regardless of what's happened in your life, this is really a glitch in your brain that you can correct.
And so go into that a little bit more. you talk about kind of the primitive or the primal brain, and that being at the root of binge eating. It's similar to other habits that are formed, like smoking or drinking. How is binge eating a brain based issue?
Yeah, I like that you brought up the primitive brain because that's a big part of what I teach. That most of the time, the first episodes of binging develop due to dieting and due to food restriction. Now, it can develop from overeating that increases over time and eventually becomes binge eating. But for now, let's stay on the path of dieting and food restriction. There's been research that shows that this creates a primitive response in your brain for survival. It's a survival mechanism that when you are food deprived, your brain is going to make food the ultimate priority. You're going to think about food more than you ever have. And anyone who has gone on a diet knows this. And it's all in that primitive brain system, that really ancient part of our brain that doesn't really have a lot of rational thought. It just senses when our survival is in danger and it motivates us to do things to help us survive. So it really makes food your primary interest. And when I dieted, I thought about food more than I ever had in my life. I wanted to eat more than I ever had in my life. And eventually that culminated in my first binge where I just felt so out of control and ate more than I ever had eaten in my entire life. And it's this mechanism where your primitive brain kind of takes over in that moment to help you survive. And then as you do that, it gives you a reward. It makes you feel good temporarily to eat all this food. Of course, like when you have self-imposed starvation and then you eat a lot of food, it is going to be sort of a pleasure process in the moment. Of course, it makes you feel terrible after. But that cycle gets rewarded in the brain, and then your brain seeks to repeat that. And it becomes like any other habit addiction that you seek out that pleasure, you seek out that dopamine response. And it becomes wired into that primitive part of your brain because the primitive brain is in charge of your survival. It's in charge of your habits. It's in charge of your pleasure. So it really becomes this repeating cycle where you want this behavior that you know is bad for you and you know is ultimately harming your life. But those urges just keep coming up in the primitive brain and driving you towards something you know you don't want to be doing.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And that is a big part of the first part of my book. When we diet, especially how we diet in this culture, which, usually involves cutting calories in half, if not more, it really does send messages to your entire body that you are in starvation mode. And your body goes through all of these processes to try to hold on to what you have. And so it really slows down your thermogenesis. It suppresses it and makes sure that it's holding on to the very calorically dense fat molecules. And then it's, slowly letting go of water and a muscle mass. But it's actually keeping the score the whole time. It's actually a proportional measure that's being recorded by the brain and by the body. And what it is when we're restricting is it's sending all of these signals to the brain that you're actually starving. So you're completely right. And the technical term for the binging that happens after the restriction is compensatory hyperphagia, because you want to make up for everything that you weren't eating before. And that's what usually slingshots you to binging and your body's desperately trying to go back to the weight it was before.
Yeah.
How did it for you turn into more of a habit? If it really wasn't about what's gone on in the past for you, and I'll agree with you, I think for some people, it is rooted in history. It is rooted in some deeper psychological issues. For some people, it is really about the restriction binge compensatory cycle primarily. But how did it become a habit for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to mention one thing you said about the primitive response. And, then you go to therapy and basically get told that, okay, this means something's deeply wrong with you. And I will also, honor what you said as far as like sometimes our patterns can be rooted in our past. And the reasons maybe you start dieting in the first place have something to do with the way you feel about yourself or your upbringing. And I know I had some of that in my past. So I always want people to honor their story. Like, of course, if something feels important for you to look at as far as your past or your emotions, absolutely look at that. I'm not saying don't, but we can't ignore this primitive process in our brain and how habits get formed and what calorie deprivation does to our body. So, everyone has issues. What I like to tell people, like, life is hard, but it still doesn't mean you're broken. Like, you can look at these primitive responses, like this is something that happens universally. And once we see that, okay, it's not just about me, it's not my unique deficits and flaws, this is a universal brain response. It just takes all of that, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me, out of it. And you can look at it in a more practical way.
Absolutely.
So,
And just to add on to that, I really wish you had heard that in therapy, because I think that that's such an important message for people, is that you may have had things happen to you. You may have had difficult relationships in the past. You may have struggled with dieting, but it absolutely doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It means that there's something wrong with dieting. It means that there's something wrong with what people did to you in the past. And I wish you had heard that. But please continue on to how it became a habit for you.
Yeah, for sure. And last thing to that, I was so young. And I know that that's the case with so many people, is you're so young and you don't know what the dieting is doing to you. And then again, go to therapy and, oh my gosh, something's wrong, instead of really educating the patient that dieting is the problem. You're not the problem. Sure, we can work on some things, but the diet is the problem. So that's kind of how it became a habit, is in relation to dieting, because I kept going back to dieting as the solution, which then perpetuated that survival response. So I would diet, try to burn off the calories by my form of purging was over exercise. So I would really exercise for hours and hours to try to make up for these binges. And then my body was in that survival response again, and then I would binge again, and then I would go back to dieting. So it became this yo-yo cycle where I would starve and then binge and starve and binge. And once that gets repeated enough times, like I talked about it's this reward process in the lower brain. And even though it's a ultimately harmful behavior that causes pain in your life, in the moment that you're relieving yourself from starvation, it does feel good. It is highly rewarding. All the neurochemicals are firing that make you feel like, oh my gosh, this is the right thing to do in the moment. So once you do that enough times, it's like your body and brain kind of get hooked on that. And even I stopped dieting at some point. Like at some point, a nutritionist or someone really kind of educated me that it's not going to work if you keep restricting your food. And I kind of knew that intuitively as well. But by the time I stopped dieting, I think it had already become a habit. It had already been, it's like, I describe it as a brain glitch, where your primitive brain actually starts to feel and act and respond as if you need massive amounts of food to survive. It's like, someone who gets addicted to a substance like alcohol. It's not a direct comparison. There are some differences there, but the body and brain actually react as if you need the alcohol to survive. And the same thing happens with binging. Of course, we need food to survive, but we don't need massive amounts of it. But that's how the brain and body come to respond, like as if you need massive amounts of food. So I had these urges that just kept coming up, and it really felt like binging was kind of a life or death thing. That's what my body and brain made me feel like. And I do think that's the primitive response of habit, which can exist even when dieting stops.
Yes, absolutely. So let me ask you this. How did you develop the brain-based recovery concepts that helped you stop binge eating? And how can others do the same?
Yeah. And I always want to give credit to the book that helped me the most, which was Rational Recovery by Jack Trimpey. And it's a much older book, and it was about alcoholism. I just mentioned alcoholism and drug use. And he talked about the beast brain. And it was a very simple way that he described it, that you have this primitive force inside of you, but it's not you. And it was very much about separating yourself and who you are and your higher self from that primitive part of yourself. And I had never really heard it described that way, because in therapy, it was always like binging is really a symbol a symbolic way you're trying to cope. It's an expression of some deep need that you have. Like that's important to you, to who I was. And when I read Rational Recovery, it was suddenly like, no, that's not you. That is not you at all. Like you're not the person who wants to binge. That's something that's in your beast brain or your primitive brain. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so different. And I didn't really think it could work, but I had an urge like pretty shortly after reading the book, and I was able to kind of stand apart from it, like detach from it without really being able to describe what I was doing. I was able to observe this process that was happening and all these thoughts that were encouraging binging, all of these feelings that were driving me toward the food that I had been following for so long. And I was able to kind of stay in who I was and see all that as not me. And it just kind of worked. And I was like, this is different. And I was scared that it wasn't going to continue working, but I just kept going day after day. And some days were harder than others as far as being able to stay detached. But I started just recognizing that it was these urges or these automatic response of the primitive brain that drove me toward food. Like that was the problem. The urges were the direct cause of the binging. Like all of the emotions, any stress, all the childhood issues, whatever, that was indirectly related, maybe in some ways, but it was this urge that made me feel like binging was necessary for survival. That was the direct cause. So I had to just learn to recognize the urges in any and all situations, regardless of whatever emotions were going on, and then stay detached from them, stay separated, be able to observe the urge and not act on it. And then when you don't do that over and over and over, you decondition the habit just like you would decondition, a habit to smoke. It doesn't really have to be that much more complicated. It's not always easy, but I don't think it has to be a lot more complicated than that.
Absolutely. You're basically describing the concept of mindfulness, which I think, I resonate very much with. It's a big part of my book. I think when we raise our conscious awareness and we look at what we're doing objectively, we can then take the emotion out of it and we can see the behavior for exactly what it is, and then be able to kind of rationally decide whether or not we want to engage in that behavior. And if you're looking at that also from a behavioral perspective, when you actually resist that urge to binge, you're extinguishing that behavior, which I think is really important. And when you don't engage in that behavior and you are, positively rewarding yourself somehow for not doing that, whether it's just patting yourself on the back or just feeling really good about resisting that urge, you're creating these new neural pathways in your brain that support your recovery. So I'm resonating so much with what you're talking about. And this is a lot of what I do with my clients as well. I also want to go back a little bit and talk about the compensatory behavior of overexercising. A lot of people don't equate bulimia with overexercising. They can, often equate it with vomiting. And I think that you did also engage in that behavior, but your compensatory behavior was mainly exercise. Can you give our listeners a better picture of what that actually looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, it was characterized as non-purging bulimia. The DSM recently has gotten rid of that label, but it is a form of purging, exercise is. And I actually tried to self-induce vomiting because when you binge, you feel so awful and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I do that? It's almost like your higher brain comes back on board after your lower brain had taken over. Your lower brain is what I call the primitive brain. And you feel like you have to do something to kind of make it right. But the problem is it doesn't make it right at all. It compounds the problem. It's a dangerous behavior. But it is in some way a way to try to undo the damage. But like I said, it really just causes more damage. So I did try to self-induce vomiting. Thankfully, it never worked for me. There's the way maybe my physiology is. I never could do it. So I turned to exercising as my way of trying to burn the calories. I mean, there was a point in my bulimia where I was exercising 7 to 8 hours on days after binges. And it was like completely exhausting. I mean, it took up my entire life. I would bring my like college books and put them on the elliptical and just ride all day and study. And it was awful. It was terrible. But I felt like I had to do something to, make up for it. But it, like I said, it just compounded the problem. It still sent the signal to my body that I, needed food, and it wasn't a permanent fix. It just perpetuated the cycle.
What was it like? If you could just describe, I can only be on the treadmill for like a mile, and I'm like, oh, that's enough. What did it actually feel like to be there hour after hour? Did your feet go numb? Were you, injuring yourself? What was the experience actually like?
It was very compulsive too. I think at some point that also became a habit. Like, I have to do this. And if I didn't do it, I felt wrong or something. So I do think that part of it can become habitual as well. I mean, I would pack multiple sets of clothes because I would sweat so much, and I would change gyms a lot of times because I was embarrassed. I didn't want to stay on the same place. So like I had the college gym, I had like a apartment gym, so I would kind of move around to try to hide it. So it was secretive in some ways. And yeah, it just felt like a terrible obligation that I never wanted to do. But I felt compelled in some way just to do it. And I know people feel the same way about self-induced vomiting or taking laxatives. Like, even though it's awful, they feel compelled to do it to try to undo the damage of the binge, but it just creates a bigger problem.
Did anybody at the gyms ever notice it? Did they ever point it out to you? Did they ever say, hi, I noticed you've been here for a very long time?
Yeah. I mean, I think, sadly, when I was underweight, I think it's been a long time now. I've been recovered for 20 years, but I seem to recall more people making comments like, are you okay? Like, when I was underweight, once I started to put on weight from binging, I feel like people paid less attention, which is weird. And I think that's maybe something that people need to know, is that eating disorders come in all shapes and sizes. Just because you're not thin or not emaciated from anorexia doesn't mean you're not struggling. And weight, you can struggle with an eating disorder at any weight.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the biggest myths. And, to hear that you went through that and, saw people responding more when you were thinner speaks to that kind of myth. Mm-hmm. Did you ever notice anyone else in the gym struggling like you were?
That's a good question too. I think so. And I don't know, you just never know what people are struggling with, but I feel like I would see others for, similar amounts of time, or see the same people over and over, and just not really knowing, or see people that had lost a lot of weight. But I mean, I don't remember any like specific conversation. I was very zoned in on what I needed to do, that I tried to just tune everything else out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, wow. When you wrote this book, what was some of the feedback you received from people? Because I know that you have a really large following. You have a lot of people who really resonate with this. What was some of the feedback that you got?
Yeah, I published it just independently back in 2011, and I would mail the individual books from my house when they were ordered from my website. I wasn't even on Amazon at the time. So I remember the first email I got from someone that said, oh, this has changed my life. It's completely turned around the way I view things, and I've stopped binging. It just made it all worth it. And I've continued to get those emails over time. Clients I work with also in coaching tell me the same thing. So it's really wonderful to hear that positive feedback of, you've really helped me see that I'm not broken. You've really helped me see that I have control of this. I've spent my whole life thinking I needed to solve all these other issues, and I've realized that I can actually get rid of this habit and just move on with my life as an imperfect person. So yeah, I've continued to get that feedback. I mean, not all positive. I probably have, I think I have 4.5 stars on Amazon or something like that. Like, so there's negative ones there too. And people who, it is a controversial message in some ways. Like, and I've published a second edition of Brain Over Binge that is a little more, tries to make a bridge to therapy a little more. I feel like in the first round that I wrote it, I was a little, I don't know about resentful of therapy, but I felt like it really led me in the wrong direction it didn't solve the issue. Like, sure, it was helpful to talk about some emotions and problems, but I wanted to stop binging. So I was a little harsher on therapy. But then over time, as you learn and evolve and learn that it does help some people, and some people need both. They need this education about the primitive brain and habits, and they also need some emotional work and therapy and things like that. So in the second edition, which I published in 2022, I was able to bridge that gap a little more and just really tell people that everyone is on their own journey and you need to use what works for you.
Absolutely. And, being a therapist, reading your book, and first hearing about it, I was like, oh, that's a little scary to think about that, this is a book that's absolutely rejecting therapy. But when I read through it, what I realized is the overwhelming message that you were getting was that you were broken. And that really made me feel sad, because I feel like as clinicians, it's our responsibility to be very, very cautious and careful with our clients and to do no harm. So, if you were receiving this message and kind of constantly being told you have to work through these issues in order to recover, I think that teaches something to therapists that, really anyone who comes to therapy, if we are viewing them as broken, I don't think we're necessarily doing the best job. I think we need to see people as, whole, complete, and perfect as they are. And they may just be struggling like we're all struggling with a certain issue. And it may have deeper rooted, background, or it may just be coming from something like dieting. But, if we as therapists are giving that message, I think that we need to do a little bit better. And so even if you've, kind of gotten that backlash, I think that that's important. And I see, you creating the second book to help bridge that. But I think it was important to say, and I think that's why it's resonated with so many people who've struggled for so long. And I think it's really important as a clinician that you adopt more than just the kind of, broken, therapy person model. You need to employ behavioral techniques. You need to speak to somebody on a logical level too. You also need to speak to them on a somatic level and really help them understand and get in contact with their body. So I do think you're teaching people, no matter what, if you received a little bit of a negative feedback from the therapy world. And if it's helping people, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
So we're out of time for this half of this episode, but we're going to be coming back and I'm going to be picking your brain some more. So I hope you're ready for some more questions. But thank you all for joining us. Tune in next week for the second half of this wonderful interview with the author of Brain Over Binge, Kathryn Hansen. Wow! Thanks for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. Please remember, the content shared on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. You can find us anywhere podcasts are streaming, on YouTube at my.anew.insight and at anew-insight.com under the ANEW Body Insight Podcast tab. Follow us on our socials at my.anew.insight on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads for more updates. Tune in next time and evolve with us.